I've seen a little preview of it, and I think he's going to even mention certain things like ancient scrolls and tablets. So I'm expecting that maybe part of this video he recorded right behind the Pyramid of Giza, but we'll see if that's really the case. Go ahead, Ethan.
All right, thank you very much for that, Ares. I appreciate it. No, I'm not gonna. I didn't record any of it behind the Pyramid of Giza, but we do have Egyptian stuff in here, so we'll get to that in a minute. So I wanted to start out by answering the question of why archival storage, and the reason is that we'll get into this in more detail. Modern human society is built on written transmission of data. Originally, it was analog data, but now it's digital data, and this transmission of digital data is becoming increasingly important. It used to be that people might be able to, remember everything they needed to remember. And in fact, people ancient times had better memories than we do. We actually know that. But there's just a tremendous volume. You can't do that anymore, okay? Used to be that you had somebody who was a scientist who was an expert literally at everything, and now, not so much. So the question that we're going to try to answer today is, how can we build systems that'll store information for a really long time that both A, preserve the bits themselves? Keeping bits for centuries is not easy. Heck, we have trouble keeping bits for 5 years. And of course, the second thing is that it's not enough to say, here are the bits. 5 years from now, I'm pretty sure we'll be able to find something that decodes a GIF, even though we don't use them anymore. But 100 years from now or 200 years from now, who knows? So we've got to allow future generations to access information, not just data, not just bits, okay? An example of this, by the way, is 2,000 years old. It's the library at Alexandria. Their goal was to preserve all of what they knew of as human knowledge, and that's what all the scrolls in here are. There are librarians in there, and it did really well, of course, until it burned down. And the result of it burning down is really echoed across the millennia. There are plays by ancient Greek playwrights that we don't have because they burned down with the Library of Alexandria. Well, that's really bad. We lost that data forever. We know they existed. People referred to them. We just don't know what they said. We'd like to prevent that from happening to all of our stuff as well. So let's start off by defining what we mean by archival storage. There are a couple of potential things. First of all, there's preserving bits, ensuring that you can read the bits later. If I give you a big bag of bits, don't tell you what they are, you can then say, I'll give them back to you 5 years, 10 years, 100 years from now. 100 years is getting pretty tough. And the reason 100 years gets tough is that there are periodic refreshes you're going to probably have to do. Think about, never mind 100 years ago, think about 20, 30 years ago. Hard drives held megabytes of data, not gigabytes or terabytes, megabytes, right? Think about the kinds of interfaces, the kinds of media you had. It would have been really hard to say, yeah, let's keep it for 30 years. And this is, by the way, something we already run into. You know, when they find old tapes sitting around in a former McDonald's. No, I'm not kidding about this. Old tapes that had NASA data on them. Gee, that's great. We have the tapes. Where are the readers? Well, we have a problem. But let's say you could read the data. Let's say you could get the bits back. Now we have a problem about information. Okay, so there are bits. What do the bits mean? Can you understand the bits? Now, this sounds like a pretty easy thing. Hey, I just look up the JPEG spec. Yeah, about that. First of all, the JPEG spec's pretty big. And second of all, this assumes you have the JPEG spec and that you know how to read it properly. We'll talk more about these things over the next approximately 50 minutes. But the big thing here is that it's not enough to simply preserve the bits. You've got to preserve the meaning also. Now, sometimes you have functionality that's a little bit of both, like integrity of information. It's very hard to tell if you've copied the information right or if you preserved it properly if you don't understand what the information is supposed to mean, okay? So why do we care about archival storage? Well, we care about it because our civilization's legacy gets passed on to the next generation physically, right? Somehow physically, whether it's an oral or written or something else. We don't have information encoded in our genes. Well, at least we don't have that yet. I'm not going to talk about that. That's the biologist, that's not me, okay? Historically, we had analog information. So up until, let's say 50 years ago, everything was analog, either oral, you'd tell people stuff, or it was written. But these days, the vast majority of the information is digital. Now, I know what you're thinking. Wait a minute, movies, video, talks like this. This is analog, right? Well, no. It's analog for me, but for every single other person listening to this talk, it's digital because I'm on a computer in my house and so are you. Therefore, all this information is digital. We've got what I'll call sensor data. And by sensor, I mean something we got by sensing the world around us, like medical records or videos and images, right? Those are sensors. They're image sensors or microphones, they're sensors. Internet of Things sensors, right? All of those things are observations of the real world. Then you have data that's created. Now you may say, oh, but a movie is created, right? Well, sort of. The text, the script is certainly created by somebody. The pictures were originally, however, recorded by sensors, but then when they were edited or combined, take a picture of Iron Man, but of course, really Iron Man in front of a green screen is a really boring movie. So there's lots of editing and combining, and that we have to remember. Now, digital data, therefore, is fundamental to future generations because as a culture, as a society, we pass information on to the future. Of course, doing it digitally poses unique challenges that analog doesn't quite pose, and we'll get to those today. But before we do, one quick thing, and that is this picture. Now, that's me from about 30 years ago, and that picture originally was analog. So I went back, found the photos, scanned it in, no problem at all. Well, mostly no problem. Part of it is that it was printed on photographic paper. And of course, photographic paper fades over time. It's 30 years old. Yes, I'm actually a little obsessive. I kept the negative and put it in a nice, safe place, but still, will that be around in 100 years? A lot of films, they're having trouble with that. So let's talk about preserving information, preserving bits. If you were an ancient people, you wanted to give information to the next generation, okay? And there were two ways to do this. At first, there was only oral. You could pass down information orally. You could tell the next generation, okay? Now, oral transmission has some rather serious problems with integrity. And by integrity, I mean keeping it so you don't change things. If you've ever played a game of telephone as a kid, where you whisper into the next person a phrase, and then it goes around the circle, 8 people, you hear what comes out. Boy, does it get garbled. Imagine if all of your information was treated that way. That's a problem with oral transmission. Did he say the right thing or not? What did that mean, right? That's a problem with oral transmission. So they developed writing, physical transmission, much more reliable because it's a symbol. Hopefully it doesn't degrade over time. So on the left here, on the top left, you have ancient Chinese writing on bones. Middle on the right, you have Egyptian hieroglyphs. And the middle on the left, you have a linear B tablet. More about that later. And on the bottom right, you have Mayan hieroglyphs. Now, these are all ways to preserve analog information. Now, yes, I know it's analog and not digital, and you're probably saying, well, gee, we're doing digital. Why do we care about analog? Well, we care about it because these examples are all well over, except for maybe the Mayan, well over 1,000 years old. Therefore, they managed to preserve information from millennia. Can we do it ourselves? Well, we have to make sure that, number one, the media is reliable, it doesn't fall apart, that the media is readable 1,000 years later. We have to make sure there's data integrity. How do we know what we see is what we were supposed to see? And then how do we preserve the meaning of the information? So let's talk about that. Some media are more reliable than others. Okay, paper, which is on the upper right, that's the Heracles papyrus, 3rd century, is unreliable. You have to constantly recopy it. Parchment, upper left, which is the Dead Sea Scroll, is more reliable, but it's still vulnerable. We were very lucky that those things lasted 2,000 years. Most parchments don't. Now, stone on the bottom left can be very reliable. That is, if nobody deliberately erases it. And those Egyptian hieroglyphics bring us to a first example. It was not uncommon for an Egyptian ruler to order that the records of their predecessors be erased. And they sometimes did this by chiseling. And one reason we know about Ramses II is he was pharaoh for a really long time and chiseled really deep. Now, lest you think that this is just something the ancient Egyptians had a problem with, it's not. This is a photo that I took of a monument in the main square in Santa Fe, New Mexico. It says, to the heroes who have fallen in the various battles with blank Indians in the territory of New Mexico. Yeah, see the blank right here? Yeah, that used to say something. In fact, I looked it up, it used to say savage. Now, with savage Indians is really not something you want to say, so in 1974, an unknown man, notice this wasn't an official thing, an unknown man wearing a hard hat chiseled out the word from the monument. So how do we know it said savage in the first place? Well, found a book. The book had a copy from before, and he didn't modify the copy of the book. So by recopying information, you can get survival. If you only have one copy and you ruin the one copy, you lose data, okay? So data integrity, one way to do it is have lots of copies. This is Mary Baker and David Rosenthal doing lots of copies, keep stuff safe, LOCKSS. Well, how do you make lots of copies? And because there are problems with errors. So one way you could do this is to complicate the material. This is a page from Psalms, and notice it's beautifully decorated. You've got all those flowers, flowers, fancy letters and everything. Part of the reason for complicating it, of course, it's a prayer. We want to make it look nice, but also because we want to make sure you take the time to do it right. And it turns out, according to the person who owns this, which is my colleague, Professor Darrell Long, they made a mistake. They actually said the word God twice where it should have only been once. So they even made a mistake despite having tried not to. Okay, so maybe that's one way to do it, is you complicate the material, but you can go further. That's a Torah scroll. And there are rules for copying it. So you can see, it's kind of hard to see up here, right? That this is made of sheets of parchment sewn together. If you make a mistake, you are required to correct the mistake. If you cannot correct the mistake, you throw out the parchment. You cannot put it in saying, cross it off and put the right thing later. Not allowed. There are lots of rules for copying a Torah scroll that make sure that you do it right, okay? Now, the last thing you could do is just make lots of copies, right? And here's an example of making lots of copies.
Ever since people started recording information, there's been a need to duplicate it.
Very nice work, Brother Dominic. Thank you. Very nice. Now, I would like 500 more sets. Brother Dominic, how are you? Could you do a big job for me? Here are your sets, Father. The 500 sets you asked for. It's a miracle.
So as you can tell, that was an ad for Xerox from the mid-1970s. That's the reason why the quality isn't so great. And the point here is that by doing this, right, you were able to, you got integrity of information, right? And basically you got lots of copies. Of course, they spent their lives copying books. The joke is now they were able to do it this way. All right. So next we want to preserve meaning. Okay, how do we preserve meaning? We often assume that languages don't change over time, but of course they do. Spanish, Italian, and French are all basically corruptions of Latin. Corruptions, evolutions, whatever you want to call them, right? But it's not just the languages, it's the symbols themselves that change, okay? And one example of this that I ran into is that if you look at the Dead Sea Scrolls, it turns out the Hebrew is readable, believe it or not. You can read the Hebrew on the Dead Sea Scrolls if you know modern Hebrew, except for one part where they have 4 letters that are unreadable. And the reason they're unreadable is it was the name of God in the old script. They didn't want to translate it to the new script because they weren't sure that was okay. But over long periods of time, everything changes. And here's an example of this. On the top right, you have, these are both, by the way, tablets from the island of Crete. The top right is written in what's called Linear B, which for centuries we couldn't read until the mid-1950s when someone decrypted it, essentially, discovering, hey, this is ancient Greek, written with weird symbols. Well, now we can read it. On the bottom right is Linear A. Yeah, it turns out we have no idea what that says. So the bits are preserved. Yay, can't read them. Ugh. So how do we fix this? Well, approach number 1 is to translate during copying. So you can see our page from Psalms again. And the idea is that you just translate into the new language each time. Now, this was actually translated from Hebrew to Greek and then Greek to Latin in all likelihood. I don't think the Vulgate was translated directly from the Hebrew. Problem is you can get errors in translations, and this is what you get when you have errors in translation. The Hebrew word for rays of light is keren, which sounds an awful lot like the Greek word, like the Greek and Latin root kornu, which means horns. Rays of light coming out of Moses' head turns into horns on Moses' head. Oops, we screwed up. Okay, well, we fixed that. We know Jews don't have horns. But there are more serious problems, okay? The 6th commandment in Hebrew is lo tirtzach, which translated directly means don't murder. Probably a lot of people are familiar with thou shalt not kill. Well, kill and murder The same idea, except murder means if it's justified, it's not murder anymore. Kill is kill for any reason. So if some guy is shooting at you and you shoot back, that's killing, but it's not murder. Sixth Commandment allows it in Hebrew, but not in English. Oops. Now, the second approach is the Rosetta Stone. Let's provide versions in multiple languages. In this case, we have hieroglyphics, hieratic, and Greek. Even with these multiple versions, it was still hard to translate the hieroglyphics. And it was only possible because some of the hieratic was written in Coptic, which had phonemes, and because the names of some of the Egyptian rulers were in cartouches. And a cartouche is just an oval with the symbols inside it. So with multiple simultaneous versions, we can understand maybe, but we take extra space. That's not so good. Okay, so now let's get to the part where we have things that we can do as systems people. The first thing we want to do is build systems to preserve the bits, because I don't care what you do to try and preserve the meaning, that doesn't do any good unless you actually have bits to translate. So the first thing we're going to worry about is how reliable is the underlying media, right? How long does it last? If you write something there, how quickly do you have to go back and fix it? Second thing you have to worry about is performance. Something like stone, right? Very, very durable, but really slow writing. I mean, chisel, 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 right? Third thing we're concerned about is volumetric density. If I store data in this medium, how big is it? Is this thing something I can carry around in my pocket, or is this something that I have to build an entire temple for, like stone? Next, you have overall system cost. Okay, we want to store data, but we're cheap. We don't want to pay for it. And it's especially an issue for archival data because it's not something that you have to pay for once. You have to pay for it for the next 100 years. There are two things you worry about. One of them is capital expenses. How much does it cost to buy the media? How much does it cost to buy the equipment and the infrastructure and so on? And then operational expenses. Okay, you bought everything. Now how much does it cost to run the thing? Now, it's very often the case that high capital expense systems have low operating expenses or vice versa. But there's a good reason for this. It's not something that's, that's just intrinsic one way or the other. It's that if it's expensive to buy it and it's expensive to maintain it, why would you use that? Get what it's expensive to buy and cheap to maintain, or cheap to buy, expensive to maintain, right? Now, if you say, well, both capital expense and operating expense are low, well, then all the other media go away unless the performance is an issue. But there are intangible things too that you can't encode this way. One of them is, can you read the media with lesser technology? For example, microfiche, which is how people used to store a lot of information, just photographs greatly reduced of paper. Now, this sounds like a kind of a primitive technology, but the nice thing is all you need is a magnifying glass and a light. Now, we've been able to build those for 400 years, so you can store a lot of stuff that way, right? Whereas if I were to hand you a Blu-ray disc and say, we don't have a Blu-ray player, go read that. Very difficult. But not as bad, by the way, as here's an SSD, go read that. At least the Blu-ray disc, you have a chance of shining light off of it and building a system. The SSD, you're going, there's cells in here. How do I read those? Zero power maintenance is another sort of intangible. And these are just examples. Can I take the media, stuff it in my closet or in a cave, and come back in 50 years and expect to be able to read it with no power, no maintenance, no nothing? For some media, the answer is yes. For other media, the answer is maybe not. So let's talk about media. We also care about performance. We care about two things, latency and bandwidth, which I'm sure you're all used to, except that we only care about latency for read. If we want to get data back, and even if the latency is a day, it may be okay. Well, this is a really cheap archive medium, but it'll take a day to get your data back. Well, it's okay, I can wait for a day, it was cheap. Now, bandwidth we only care about, or we primarily care about for writes. How much data can I write per day, right? The reason that that's the case is that all of the data in your archive has to be written exactly once. Yes, I know you, quote, overwrite it, but then you have to write the original and write the new, so exactly once. But only some of your data might be read. How much data? Depends on the workload. Some systems, the answer is 1/100th of 1%, or even less of the data is read. Or we just keep it just in case, it's Sarbanes-Oxley, we keep it in case the federal government gets after us. Other ones, like Facebook, well, more of the data gets read, and somewhere it's even more of that. There is, however, one additional operation, and that's called refresh, which is not the same thing as writing and reading. It says, how do I make a new copy of data that's already in the archive? Now, for some media, that involves reading it and then writing it. But for other media, let's say like DNA, I can make a copy of DNA without actually reading and writing it. I just, you know, put the appropriate materials in and the appropriate enzymes, and I have a copy. No reading and writing necessary. So those are the three things we want to keep in mind. Now, when we talk about preserving the bits, we have lots of choices for media, okay? For example, we have, oh goodness. Sorry about that, my computer just went to sleep. That's always lots of fun. Okay, so we have lots of choices for long-term archival storage, everything from tape and disk to SSD and Blu-ray, and on the bottom, some newer technologies like glass and DNA. And we'll go into each of these individually. But we want to know how to choose the right medium and what happens if this choice evolves over time. You know, DNA, I can tell you right now, not really viable in terms of cost currently. Doesn't mean it won't be in 5 or 10 years, and we'll talk about that. So we're going to compare the trade-offs between the cost, the upfront and the operating expense, the reliability and durability, bandwidth and latency, and we're going to use radar charts to compare these media. Okay. So let's start off first with tape. And these radar charts are all going to have the same things. Now, one thing you'll notice here, by the way, is that some of these things are really weird. Like, why is read latency in inverses of seconds? Well, because we wanted to make bigger better. And, well, a higher read latency is not a better thing. So we did 1 over seconds. I know it's artificial, but the goal here is to see the shape of the blotch, which tells you what it's good at. So tape is good because these are further out at media cost and infrastructure cost. Not so good at density, so-so at operating expense. Read latency and write latency aren't great, and write bandwidth aren't that great either, okay? So the big problem here, we've got an access latency of 5 to 100 seconds, and that's with a tape robot. But you do have good bandwidth, 200 plus megabytes per second, and well, our media cost is about $5 a terabyte currently. Infrastructure cost, the drives are expensive. Good news here, and we don't have this, is that durability is pretty good. If we have infrequent reads and writes, tape is durable. We can read it after 40 or 50 years. And we know because, well, it's been around for that long and we've read tape that old. So we know that tape is a decent way to store data for a long time. It's a proven technology. And the nice thing is that at least for tape, generally speaking, you don't have to touch it for 5, 10 years. It'd be nice if you retensioned the reel, you know, unwound it, rewound it, but that's not absolutely essential. So it's a pretty good medium, and it's the sort of thing where you go, oh, you got to beat that if you're going to win. Okay, so what's next? Well, next we have optical disc. Okay, for optical disc, it's again a relatively mature technology. Okay, access latency, yeah, it's going to take seconds to load it, about 20 milliseconds to seek to a new location. So load time, again, removable media, on the order of a minute. But once you have it loaded, you can seek anywhere on the disk you want. Bandwidth, not for your garden variety Blu-ray, but the ones that Panasonic and other companies sell, about 180 megabytes a second, which is pretty good. Media cost, yeah, that's where it gets you. You're talking about tens of dollars per terabyte, which is really expensive. But the good news is the infrastructure cost can be really cheap, right? Now, as far as Blu-ray goes, the drives can wear out. In fact, you have to buy new drives occasionally, but the disc media itself is incredibly durable. There's a type of media called M-disc, which actually uses an inorganic pigment. And when you burn the DVD or Blu-ray, you literally burn the inorganic material. It's supposed to last for on the order of millennia. In fact, M-disc stands for millennia disc, okay? So that's nice. It means I can make my archive copy, put it on the shelf in the salt mine, and come back to it in 20 years and still read it if I have drives available, which is good. Right, so again, the infrastructure cost here is very low, so that's kind of pretty far out to the side. Read latency and write latency are pretty good. Density is not great. Operating expense so-so, and media cost, that's pretty high. But you can see the shape there. Next, we go to disk. Disk has actually even worse density than optical disk, but on the other hand, it's not that expensive. It's $20 a terabyte for media, about $5 for infrastructure. I can run the darn thing off of a Raspberry Pi. In fact, I can run several drives off of it. Performance is great, 10 millisecond access latency and 200 megabytes a second bandwidth, but we're not going to get disks to be that much denser. The density increase has slowed down. The big problem with disks is that they're not very durable. They last 5 to 7 years. According to people in the disk industry, yeah, we could build 10-year disks or 12-year disks, but 10, 12 years, I want 100. So I'm going to have to keep copying over and over. That's going to increase my cost for operating expenses. Okay? What about Flash? Flash, it turns out, is actually a very interesting one because it's not quite mature, but we are limited, but we're getting there. And growth rate's limited. Latency and bandwidth, absolutely obscene. 50 microsecond read latency, 1 gigabyte per second write bandwidth, that's great. Cost, on the other hand, yeah, $80 a terabyte for media. That's at 8 cents a gig, okay? And same kind of $5 for infrastructure. Now, the durability is interesting. The flash itself doesn't go bad as long as you don't write it. However, if you don't write it, the bits leak out over time. Now, you probably don't notice this because consumer flash has high retention at the cost of lower number of writes. But it turns out that if you wait long enough, the bits leak out. They're just capacitors. It's like DRAM with a much slower leak. Why is that important? Because we can't just put it on the shelf. If you do that and come back in 10 years, it's a good bet much of your data will be corrupted. We don't want that, okay? So that's, again, something to think about when you're considering how to actually decide what media to use. So now we have Project Silica. This is a Microsoft project to write data in glass, okay? And you can see a picture here of someone holding up the glass that they're using. Physical position for read latency could be 50 milliseconds. Write bandwidth, I've heard about 50 megabytes a second for write once. And the read is under a terabyte. Why? It's glass. Glass is really cheap, okay? Infrastructure costs, the writers are likely more expensive, okay? However, the readers are going to be less expensive, and that hopefully will work pretty well, okay? Now, if you then look at durability and reliability, this is glass. The media and the engraved data should last centuries as long as you don't drop it. Again, it makes little microscopic holes in glass. Basically, it evaporates the glass, leaves a little hole, and they can change the shape of the hole and everything else. There's a whole talk on this, which I encourage you to look at if you're interested in looking for it. It's online. But the idea is that this is a much cheaper medium, and it is a hands-off medium. You can let it go and just, it works. Now, when we get to the end, you'll see different shapes of things, but this is the first one that has a different shape. Write and read are a little worse, but OpEx is really good, and media cost is really good. Infrastructure cost is pretty good too. Slightly different shape, off center, than what we had for tape and disk. Now we have DNA, and DNA is a totally different shape. DNA, as you can see, is incredibly dense, okay? All right, it's the densest of the media we have. Volumetric density is amazingly high. On the other hand, read latency is really bad. Read latency is on the order of a day. Yes, a day. Why? You have to do DNA sequencing. We know how to do this, but it does take about a day, okay? Now, over here, you have operating expense, again, pretty darn bad because you got to keep the DNA refrigerated and everything else. Infrastructure costs pretty bad, millions of dollars for writers. We hope this will go down, and we'll talk about that in a minute. Write bandwidth we think is also pretty bad for now, but all this will improve over time. And at least we know DNA is durable because, well, we can hopefully reconstruct a mammoth, and, well, that's done with DNA. Okay. Oops. Now, what we're going to do next is do a comparison of all of them. And I've taken all of those previous graphs and superimposed them. Now, I know this is a very busy thing, but that's all I've done here is superimpose the previous graphs, okay? Now, once I've done that, I can talk about some things. First of all, glass, this is using the same color. So glass is over here, it's the red, it's pretty promising, right? Read latency and write bandwidth are a little worse than some of the other ones, but they're worse than flash. Well, flash is going to be pretty good, okay? There are slight lags in performance, but cost is an issue. But cost is pretty good here, pretty good here. Infrastructure cost may likely drop as the technology matures. That's a good thing. Let's look at disk. Disk is green. Notice that disk has higher OpEx and it's got media cost and everything else. Disk is actually not entirely inside of flash because it's got lower infrastructure cost and better bandwidth. But if you don't want to read it very often, maybe glass is a better bet. Flash, amazingly good read and write. Duh, you knew that. Infrastructure cost is low, but media cost, it's the worst of them, okay? And, you know, OpEx over here is also pretty good, but media cost, and that's a big thing. Flash is kind of expensive. Sorry about that. So Flash needs to improve OpEx and media cost. DNA, if you look over here, it's great at density. Everything else is really bad. You know, we kind of figured that. There is a lot of room for improvement, though, and that's what we're going to try to project here. This is what we think it might be in the future, well, 5, 10 years out. And again, this is just a guess because, hey, if I knew the answer here, I could make a lot of money. I don't. Tape, you're going to get significant capacity growth up to, say, 400 terabytes in one tape cartridge. Disk growth, however, is becoming limited. SSDs are getting denser. So SSDs are doing pretty well, but notice the media cost here, however, is getting a little bit worse for SSDs just because it's getting worse relative to the other ones. Okay. It is likely that glass will overwhelm tape, however, because here's glass in red, and tape is in black. What it means to overwhelm it is that tape has a slightly better density, volumetric density. Everything else is worse than it is for glass. When something like that happens, the technology is going to disappear. Optical disc isn't even on here because we know it's going to disappear relative to glass and to tape. Okay. Now, what that means is that DNA, notice how instead of being as narrow as it was, it's getting broader, but it's still pretty big. And by the way, DNA here, we're giving it a 4 orders of magnitude drop on media cost and a 3 orders of magnitude drop on infrastructure cost, and it's still behind. So you're talking about needing 6 to 7 orders of magnitude. Could that happen? Yes. I'm not going to try to predict whether it will or not. I have no idea whether it won't. But if it does happen, DNA has a big advantage on density and longevity, meaning maybe you really want to use DNA for your archive, and that's something to consider. All right, so now we have to worry about long-term retention, right? A couple of key questions. Do bits last forever after you write them? How likely are they to rot, change over time in ways you don't predict? And how much maintenance do they need? Do I need to go through and refresh this every month or every year? Or do I just put it in a salt mine? Tape, glass, and optical disc are all put in a salt mine. Glass, stuff, I mean, you could apparently dunk it in seawater for you know, a year and it's not injured, which is pretty impressive. But other media may require more care because SSD cells, they leak. I need to refresh. I got to actually have power and do active stuff. Discs may fail to spin up, and the longer you leave them without spinning them up, the more likely it is that the lubricant will actually make them stick. DNA may require refresh, and I say may because it depends. Are you keeping it in ideal conditions, or are you leaving it on a shelf where it's kind of warm out, right? So what's the best option? Well, it depends a lot. Things like how much do you want to read? How much data are you likely to want to read? All of it, some of it, almost none of it, never unless I'm absolutely forced to? How important is latency? How fast do you want to write? In other words, are you generating a gigabyte of data a day or a gigabyte of data a second? It kind of matters. How important is it to have hands-off retention? Take this away. Make 3 copies, put them in 3 different continents in places that don't have earthquakes. How important is the physical inability to modify data? And the reason this is important, we'll get to in a minute, is integrity. These properties define the system constraints, and now we can then model system cost and reliability. One big question here is, how do you pay for this stuff, right? Users want to say, I created the data, here's your money. Problem is, you created the data and you want me to keep it forever for a fixed fee? Uh-oh. Well, Flickr and YouTube, Flickr not anymore, but YouTube, a lot of other places collect money from usage. And the problem is, archival storage could have ongoing costs. Well, for glass, maybe it's just a warehouse, but other things, refresh cycles, management costs, cost of the warehouse, cost of power, everything else. And of course, usage falls off dramatically as data gets older. So do I trade off a high initial cost? I'll charge you a lot of money, but then it won't cost me anything to maintain it. That's good. Maybe fewer refresh cycles, data is more likely to get lost. Do I pay for ongoing storage when I get revenue from new data? Well, here's the thing that it looks like. Let's say there's an exponential growth in demand for the first 5 years, like your YouTube, okay? There are 3 possible things. First one is the rate of growth started at 20% a year and then goes to 30 and 40 and 50. Well, that's going to be this, okay? Your new data, because you're storing so much more of it, overwhelms your old data, and you can pay for the old data with what you collect for new data. What if the growth rate stays constant at, let's say, 20% a year? Turns out the ratio of old data to new data about remains constant, which isn't so bad. But what happens if people start say, look, I'm not going to continue to add 20% more than's already in the archive. I'm just going to add a fixed amount of data every year. Guess what? The old data overwhelms the new data, and you can't pay for storing the old data by charging people for new data. They go, wait, why is it 4 times more expensive? Oh, because we have a lot of old data to take care of. Yeah, I'm not paying for that. This is a problem. It's what happens when you try to pay for old data using revenue from new data. Doesn't necessarily work. Yes, you can try to collect interest, but that's now the province of economists, not of computer scientists. And when storage stops getting cheaper over time, well, we have a problem. We don't know what the best way to store the data is. Storage isn't getting cheaper. We can't just rely on, oh, copy, it'll be so cheap, we'll save money. Not necessarily anymore. Storage isn't getting cheaper as much as it was. Flash is hitting size limits. Disk isn't growing at 50% a year. DNA and glass are promising. Glass is probably closer to being ready than DNA in terms of cost, but they're not yet ready. So that's one problem. Next problem is what happens when new storage isn't denser than old storage? Maybe make our storage devices last longer. Disks, instead of lasting for 5 years, last for 12. Why? Well, I can't buy a new disk that's 30 times bigger. May as well make the old one last longer. And it's important to understand these answers because we have to know the answers, or at least think we know them, when we create the archive. So let's look at cost over time. After 0 years, right? In other words, when you create the archive, this is some work that my student James Byron did. After 0 years, DNA is really expensive if you want to support for a petabyte scale archive, if you wanted to support on the order of 10 million read operations per year, right? That's after 0 years. Looks pretty clear cut. Don't use DNA. And hey, disk, which is this green line at the bottom, right? The green line down here, right? That makes it look like we should use disk, right? After 0 years, that seems like a right idea. Yeah, after 25 years, all of a sudden disk, let's see here, undo that. Disk moved up here, right? Flash, still SSD flash, still very expensive, but now it looks like glass down here is going to win. So we have to consider this when we do our models because the prices over time are going to change. Now, that means our models are only as good as our predictions are of how the costs are going to change. Here's another example of something that we care a lot about. It's something called a blast radius. We know that failures are going to happen, devices are going to fail, and everything else is going to fail, right? How much data do you lose per failure? Right? If I say that you have a 1 in 1,000 chance or 1 in a million chance of failing, right? That's your annualized failure rate, 1 in a million. That sounds pretty good. Yeah, 1 in a million chance you lose all your data. The Alexandria library burns down. All of a sudden, this is not a good thing, is it? What I care about is also the blast radius. If something fails, how much data do I lose? Well, if I have 3 copies on 3 different continents, by the way, this is what the Internet Archive does. I don't know if they have 3. I know they have 2. One of them, incidentally, in Alexandria. That means that if there's a big earthquake in San Francisco and the Internet Archive goes away, well, we have Alexandria left, which is a good idea. You want to try to make sure that a failure does not take down all your data. You are probably better off with quite a larger number of small losses because, hey, at least we'll have some plays by that playwright, as opposed to one big loss getting rid of everything, right? And that's something that traditionally we don't think about with storage systems. We assume we can keep all the data forever and that we'll be able to. Maybe we will, maybe we won't. Okay. So now let's talk about integrity and security. How do we preserve the bits? Well, first thing we need to do is ensure that that accidental modification, oops, I wrote that, we can detect that. That's not as bad because, well, nobody's trying really hard. Of course, we have to also guard against intentional modification. I'm hoping everyone here recognizes that photo, right? It's been a lot of memes recently. That's a picture of Stalin with Nikolai Yezhov, who apparently did not do well in the Soviet regime because, yeah, that's what the picture looks like now. Notice he was erased. You'd like to know that when that happens, wouldn't you? Right? That's the sort of thing you don't want to know about. And given that this already happens quite a bit, we assume it's going to continue to happen, right? So if it's going to continue to happen, How do we prevent that from happening? Well, one way was locks. We mentioned earlier, lots of copies keep stuff safe. They spend a lot of time on a protocol to agree on what the right version should be. Of course, it's also helpful to have mechanisms that prevent rewriting. Like, let's say you have read-only media. You can't rewrite on glass. You can destroy it, but at least you know it was destroyed. Here, they had to make a separate copy of the photo. I can't imagine they modified the original. They didn't have Photoshop. Did a pretty good job, though. Now, for security, you also want to know that only authorized users can read the data. You can't depend on a key, because what happens if the key is unavailable? Nobody can read the data, even if they're authorized. What if the key is leaked? Well, that doesn't sound so bad. Just re-encrypt the data. Re-encrypt all exabytes worth of data? Yeah, that's not happening. And it's not just leaked keys. It's also cryptographic obsolescence. Okay, you've got to be resistant to slow attacks as well. Attacks that can take 20 years. Why? Well, I can think of some people who might like to get our nuclear secrets, even if it takes them 20 years to do it. I can think that there are people who might want that. That's not something we plan for very much. 20 years means a long time. Things like, oh, look for all the activity. What activity? It was 20 years. Okay. So one example solution is a project that we did at UC Santa Cruz. This was published in USENIX ATC back in 2007, and that is pot shards. The idea here is secret split data across archives. So you take your data and you secret split it. This is information theoretic secure, and you send one part of each thing, one shard, to each of, in this case, 4 archives. Now, the archive provides shards only after you authenticate to that archive. We didn't say how you authenticate. The answer is just prove you are who you say you are. If it takes a court order and a photo ID, they'll just hand you the shards. We didn't make it so that you have to tell them how to do it. The user knows which shards go together and how to go get the shards they need. But the thing is that, what happens if you forget the key? What if you forget the key, if the user who's authorized goes away and it's the user's heirs that say, look, I can prove I'm allowed to have this data, but I don't know which pieces go together? The answer? Anyone who gets all of the shards, in this case, by all the shards, I mean this, 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 and this. If you get all 4 of them, you can determine how they fit together. In fact, if you get all of these, all of these, all of these, and all of these, you can also determine how they fit together, even if you didn't know those 4 went together specifically. But if you only have one archive, let's say you compromise archive 3, if you only have this, you have no way of knowing that this shard goes with this shard. You don't know which shard it goes with. You can't steal them. Now, why is this important? Well, we assumed you didn't compromise all the archives. After all, someone with infinite power can pretty much do what they want. But if you only compromise one archive, that I believe you can do, you're no closer to getting the data back. We need to have something like this for archival storage. We want to have a balance between, it's hard to get the data back, but it's easy if you can get all of the information and actually legally collect everything. That's a trade-off you have to make for archival storage. So let's talk briefly about archival storage projects. Okay? I don't have a lot of time to go into all of the gory low-level details on each one of these, but I can talk briefly about several projects. So the first one of these is the MAID project at the University of Colorado. And by the way, that's Maid Marian. You would be amazed at how hard it is to find a picture of a maid that actually is reasonable. Maid Marian, I figure, is pretty safe. So MAID is a massive array of idle disks, and it introduced the use of idle disks, spinning disks down to save power, all right? The idea here is that if you save power, you spin them back up, spin them down, you can look at reliability, you can look at power savings. This is a really good idea. The next project was some work that we did in 2008 called Pergamum, and that would be the picture on the upper left. That's the old library at Pergamum. It was the 2nd largest library in the ancient world. It actually managed the transition from papyrus to parchment. The reason being, papyrus in Alexandria, hey, grows in the papyrus reed grows in the Nile. That was easy. You move to Turkey, which is where Pergamum is, and all of a sudden, yeah, it's hard to get papyrus, so they switched to parchment. The Pergamum system was incrementally scalable and evolvable. It had these independent nodes, which we called tomes. Each one of them was a self-contained disk and a CPU and a network interface and a little bit of memory. So they all work together to be reliable, to maintain integrity, and we developed some of the algorithms for this. Now, there are 2 other projects that are very important because they're real-world implementations. First one is Pelican, and that's a nice picture of pelicans in Santa Cruz. In fact, If you remember the opening shot of a natural bridge, those pelicans are sitting on top of the natural bridge. Can't see that, I made the pelicans bigger. But they did a real world implementation, which is great. They solved a lot of difficult engineering issues. For example, power load management. How do you make sure that you supply limited power, spin up only a few disks at a time, and make sure that they're not on the same power line? This is really hard stuff. They dealt with real world networking issues. Okay, we have a limited bandwidth. How do we reduce the bandwidth? Because if we don't, we can't rebuild anything. They improved ECCs. They used locally repairable codes to reduce bandwidth for doing reconstruction. They did a lot of nice things, but the big one is they built it. They built a real world thing. We didn't have the resources to do that. The second project I want to mention, also at OSDI 2014, is F4. And by the way, Facebook guys, if you want a nice picture like this, use a better name than F4. F4, come on. Haystack was okay. F4, you get an F4 on the page. This is storage for warm data. So the idea was you had a high-ish access rate because this is where you put all those old photos and videos and everything else you upload to Facebook. It was getting expensive to store them in Haystack, so they said, how do we store warm data? We want low cost and long-term storage, but the access rate is pretty high and unfortunately not necessarily predictable. But they looked at building a system that way and how likely it was to do the accesses. So that was another very interesting project that people want to look at. Okay. All right. So the next thing is preserving the meaning of data. Okay. Now, digital data may not have an obvious meaning because while some data is relatively simple to interpret, like ASCII text, small page telling you what each code means, GIF is only 33 pages long. JPEG is worse. And then we're not even going to talk about MP4. Okay, we're not going to talk about PostScript and PDF, which are interpreted languages. I don't know about everybody here, but I've actually gotten papers to review that didn't open in PDF on my laptop. Why? Because someone made the mistake of drawing a graph with 2 million points, each one's a little dot, and they drew all 2 million points. It turns out when you do that, some interpreters choke, literally. Okay, that's a problem. Gee, it worked on the old one, why not on the new one? Microsoft Word and Microsoft Excel, right? That's also hard. Yes, I know they've moved to XML, but, well, even there, somewhat hard to do. And of course, good luck with things like WordPerfect documents, right? If you have a WordPerfect 1 document, my mother actually, who's a rabbi, wrote her sermons in an early version of WordPerfect from the 90s, and asked me, so Ethan, how do I get the sermons back? WordPerfect doesn't exist anywhere, that I could get it. Heck, it was such an old version that even I think the latest versions of WordPerfect couldn't read them. Thankfully, OpenOffice could, but that's about all I had. Okay. The thing is that standards change over time, and it gets even worse if you're talking about executables, like a video game, or something that's cross-linked with other objects. So if you build your presentation and embed the graphics, you're good. But what happens if the graphics are all linked to things on your disk and you try to store it? Now you're out of luck. This is a big challenge. I don't have time to talk more about it, but it's a very big challenge. Okay. Now, this is in response to Tony Mason's question about search, because that's a really good question. Of course, search matters, right? The analog data, it turns out there's not a lot of it and there's not much searching, but that's why we had card catalogs and librarians and everything else. Digital data is much bigger, and here's where a problem comes in. Okay, let's say I want it to be efficient and scalable. I don't want to use a single large index, because what happens when that index fails? I said when, not if, because it will fail. Well, if I had 10 million media, the only way to rebuild the index is to read all 10 million media. Every single thing is offline until that happens. Okay, this is bad. So on the top, right? Okay, on the top, I've got one big index, and it indexes everything. Well, if that index fails, I've got to reread every one of these and re-index all of them, all 10 million of them. Okay. If I want to re-index an exabyte of data, it's going to be a little while. It'll take me a bit. So what I want to do instead is build an index that can be aggregated so that I have one index on each device. That index only worries about that device. If that index fails, I can rebuild it just by reading the device, and the rest of the archive is available, right? Now this is you might say, yeah, this is kind of like slicing. Well, sort of. The thing with slices is if you slice stuff, you can be efficient about deciding what goes into which slice. Problem is here, you don't know what's on each archived media. It could be randomly determined. It could have been built over time. The index has to cross all of those, and that's why we think having a self-contained media index seems like a better idea. It's more reliable. And now we can search it by using an aggregator. Sorry, the letter R got taken off when I ran this on Keynote on my iPad. Okay. So one way that you could do this is a project called Dawn that we did, which we based on Fawn. That was the flexible array of wimpy nodes from CMU. We have a durable array of wimpy nodes. And this project, the idea here is, and this hasn't gone very far, so I encourage people to take the idea. Large number of pergamum-like tomes that only use NVM, very low power. We leave the failed devices in place. We have a commodity gigabit Ethernet network. We run queries in the background. That's the key idea here. In the background, you say, look, maybe you should look through your data for these queries. I don't need the answer right now, but maybe we could look through it and get the query in a week or two, and you could tell us something interesting about this genetic data or sensor data or something else. Medical data, societal data, big data for science, all of those are going to be kind of useful. Okay. All right, so summary here is that the challenges that we're going to have in preserving data for the long term. First one is, how do we archive 10 to the 18th bits? Reliability and integrity, indexing and searching, scalability and management. We want to ensure we can actually get the bits back in decades, but we also want to get value from the stored data to help us pay for keeping it. Otherwise, you have this thing where who's going to pay for it, right? We want to integrate all of these solutions into a system that can survive for a century or more, right? It's a very difficult challenge, and it's going to involve evolution over time. Right? It's going to involve issues of economics as well as technology. And that's why economics is one of the things we spent time on. That's great if we know how to build it, but nobody's going to pay for it. How are you going to do this? Make it useful. Make it so that keeping the data is worthwhile. Okay? So with that, I want to finish up, and I'll answer the questions online in a minute. First thing is, long-term digital preservation is really important because the fate of all the world's data is at stake. The problem isn't going away. In fact, it's getting worse fast because we don't think about what it means to keep data around forever. We just don't think about it. I mean, look, if you get someone to think 5 years out, you're doing really well. We got to think 100 years out, and not just, I built the system, it'll last 100 years. No, it won't. It's like saying I built a house, it'll last 100 years. You got to maintain it. Okay, when the house I'm in right now was built, they didn't have Ethernet, so I had to have someone run Ethernet. They didn't have smart light switches, so I had to replace them. I didn't have to replace all the wiring to replace the smart light switches, thankfully. But that's what we got to think about for storage systems. We've also got to stop thinking ad hoc. Oh, I fixed problem A and B. Yeah, but all the other problems. We can't do that. There are a lot of problems left to be solved and a lot of good systems research that I'm looking forward to seeing as people take on the challenges that I presented today, right? But one of the things I want to say here is that if you have a good product, a good research thing, there is a huge potential for impact, okay? People need this stuff, and if you get good ideas, people are going to use it. One thing I do want to stress is that integrating some level of processing with archive is likely to be a win. And by the way, that's one thing where glass doesn't do well. Glass is, sits off on the side, it's really reliable and all that stuff, but you got to read it to process it. Flash, you don't. Disk, you don't. Maybe integrating that is how you can make more active media more expensive in terms of operational expenses. Maybe that's how you can make those more viable. Hey, you can do processing on them. You can't do it on glass. Maybe it's some combination of both, right? So with that, I'm gonna finish up and thank people for their help. James Byron and everybody else in CRSS. Some of the ideas here came from discussions with Erez Zadok and others at the Banbury workshop on DNA storage in 2019. And with that, I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you very much, Ethan. Clap, clap, clap. There's a number of questions on Slack. If you want to sort of pick them off, if you're there, or I can read them off for you.
Whatever works better for you guys. I can read them, or you can read them. It's up to you.
Okay, so let me, in no particular order, there's some questions about durability, One question from Umesh Maheshwari is, why durability is not one of the spokes on the radar chart?
Yeah.
Also for flash, why is durability characterized as unknown, probably long, when it is known to have limited retention, at most few years without a refresh?
Yep.
And I would just add to that that I'm also curious, don't we have to consider environmental conditions for durability, like vibration, radiation, humidity, etc.?
Right. So the reason that I didn't do a spoke for durability is that durability is a little more complex than I think you're making it out to be. Here's the reason. You are absolutely right that retention on flash is low, meaning that the flash will not retain the charge for a very long time. Umesh is absolutely right about that. But here's the important thing. Let's say that once every 3 months, let's say retention I know to be about a year. Every 3 months I go through and I just spend a little bit of power, rewrite the flash, recharge the capacitors, right? If I do that, the flash media itself will last for 20 years. Okay, so in other words, that now gets folded into operating expense instead of I got to buy more flash. Now compare that with something like a disk, where when a disk hits 5 to 7 years old, if you leave your data on it and don't replace the disk, you are playing with fire. Not much you can do to say, oh, but can I please refresh the mechanics on the disk? Not going to work. That's why we don't have an explicit thing for durability, why it's listed as operating expense instead of durability, because durability is how long will a medium last if I want to keep using it, independent of what do I have to do to keep using it. Do I have to, as Umesh said, do I have to rewrite it? Once I rewrite it, is the flash going to be good again for another year? Yes. So I just do that every 3 months and I'm in good shape. So it's a little more complex than that. Okay. And that's why I characterize flash as an unknown, probably long, as it's how long will the flash physically last if I'm willing to pay attention to it every so often, right? Now, the second thing, the second question you were asking is, durability versus reliability. And I see Craig, you asked this question also, which I'll try to answer, right? That's a really good point. Durability, reliability, and complexity of reader devices is a really important thing for long-term storage, and we did mention it briefly, right? So the thing about that is, glass is cheap. Readers could be proprietary and expensive, but the nice thing about glass, and by the way, optical media is the same way, you can read it optically. You can read it with a microscope. Now, I'm not saying you can understand with the bit speed, but apparently a sufficiently good microscope is enough to be able to read the data engraved in glass. I did say sufficiently good, but it doesn't have to be a specialized microscope as far as I know, okay? In other words, reading is much less, as it turns out, technically easy. Sorry, much technically easier, not less. It's much easier to read glass than it is to write it. Writing it involves femtosecond lasers. I'm not a physicist, I'm not gonna try to explain it, but it involves much more advanced technology than the readers. That's a good sign. It's very good when the reading is much simpler than the writing. By the way, that's also true for DNA. We've known how to read DNA for a really long time, and we can do it really cheaply. On the other hand, writing DNA, oh God, that's hard. That's really the big problem with DNA, is writing it, because writing it is expensive and slow, bandwidth-wise. That has to improve dramatically, because I could use DNA and say, look, I'll store all the data on DNA. I don't plan to read much of it. If you want to read it, you pay the money. That works well, but when the writing is expensive, I can't afford that. That's why it's so important to make writing cheap, much more so than reading. And that's an interesting kind of comment there. Okay, so hopefully that answered Umesh's question. If not, ask another question.
Okay, good. There's another question from Tony Mason that's been echoed by others. How do we find specific thing in an ocean of data? In particular, the search problem is real now, where we're having a hard time finding what we have in our online drives and even on local drives.
Oh, absolutely. In fact, remember I said that this is challenges. Hey, if I knew how to do this, it wouldn't be a challenge. I think the solution is going to have to be some form of localized search, where each device, each medium, each clump of stuff does its own searching and then sends the results off to an aggregator, perhaps with something saying, you're probably not here. The reason is that, and this goes to the concept of blast radius, I know someone else had asked about that. We'll talk about that in a minute. If you have a single index and it fails, you have to read an awful lot of data to fix it. On the other hand, if you have an index for each device. Well, okay, this device failed. Okay, well, come on, the data's gone anyway. Or the index failed, the device is fine. Okay, reread the data for that one thing. You can't afford to reread everything. You just can't. And because of that, this is, put all your eggs in one basket and really watch the basket. The problem is if the basket holds 100 million eggs and you drop it, that's a big omelet. And it's one that will take a really long time to fix. You don't want that. What you want instead is something where you have a drive and an index for that drive so you can ask it, I'm looking for X, do you have it? Yes, I do. No, I don't. Well, that's an easy question to ask. And then you ask it of 10 million devices, hopefully using some kind of a hierarchical mechanism so you don't have to ask all 10 million devices on every query. Something like Bloom filters or a higher level index that gives you an idea. Yeah, it's probably in these guys and probably not in those guys. So levels, summaries of summaries of summaries, something like that. Anything else isn't going to scale, and it's going to be really terrible to deal with when failure happens. And yes, I did say when it happens.
Okay. One other thing that I think I noticed in the radar chart, that superimposed one,
Yeah.
it sort of seems like hard disk is not really excelling in any particular thing. Does this predict doom for it? And I hesitate saying it because people have been predicting doom for tape for decades.
No, that's actually an excellent question. And the answer is not necessarily, okay? Here's the reason why. And I brought up the slide for you. This is the futures. And again, this is a guess here. But here's the reason why it might not be doom for it, okay? If you look at this chart, you look and see, all right, flash beats hard disk in almost everything, okay? If you look over here, right? Flash beats hard disk here, 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 and here. Notice there's one place where flash loses badly to hard disk, and where is that? Right there. Now, what this means is flash beats the crap out of disk if you're willing to spend 10, 20 times as much, sure, right? Flash wins really nicely if you can afford to pay for it, right? That's the thing that's the key thing to remember is the issue is we don't want to pay a lot of money. So a jack of all trades like disk may actually win because look, it's not the best at anything, but it's good enough at everything and it's cheaper, okay? That may mean that something like disk wins. Well, that'd be kind of good, wouldn't it? Right? That's something to think about. And that's why I think that it's not the case that disk may automatically go away, because disk is not the most expensive, right? That's the key thing to think about here. Okay? So does that help to answer your question?
Yeah, perhaps this further justifies research into hybrids, trying to get sort of the best of both worlds, because this shows where's the best point for on various dimensions for different technologies.
That's right. I mean, what you might do for a hybrid is say, well, let's say the glass becomes viable. Maybe, glass looks really good. That would be the red thing over here. That's this line, right? Glass looks like it's really good in everything except for performance, right? It's not so good there, but flash is really good in performance. Maybe a hybrid between flash and glass. There's only one small problem with that. The one thing that you cannot fake, that you can't get around, is this. Whoops. That. You can't escape it, okay? Now, what you can do is parallelize it. Okay, look, so glass, if you notice, is pretty far down on the axis on that, right? The only way to get around that is let's buy lots of writers. But of course, if you buy lots of writers, that's going to increase your capital expense. That's going to increase your operating expense, things like that. But that's going to increase your infrastructure cost. But that's how you have to do it, right? That's what this is going to be, is a bunch of optimizations and how you make them.
Cool.
Okay.
Let's see. Gala Yadgar had an interesting comment that says basically, maybe 2,000 years later, there would be information that is not worth preserving. And I think that maybe brings up a high level point about retention and certain things that we want to forget after a certain point in time. Maybe we even have to.
Right. So the answer is, yeah, there are certainly things that you might want to forget after a period in time. And one of the big problems that people have is there is nothing you can do to say, I'm going to guarantee to forget it, other than to do it in such a way that natural bit rot makes it go away eventually. There was a project at the University of Washington, whose name I've forgotten, that was looking at this. See, brain actually makes bits go away, right? So the point here is that there are techniques for doing that, but they're not explicit. There's no explicit notion of time in a computer. Right? Because if you're concerned about security, the answer is I ignore your time and we're done. So what you're saying here is, how do we know what people are going to want to keep in the future? We have no idea. I'll give you an example, right? If you had asked me 20 years ago, would it be important to keep childhood photos of a mixed race kid, you know, white mother, black father living in Hawaii? If you had asked me 20 years ago how important it is to keep those pictures, the answer is, oh, well, okay, if the kid's name is Barack Obama, does that change your opinion? Right? We didn't know that back in the 60s and 70s. We had no idea the kid was going to be president. Now, it could have been any kid. It happened to be him. Do we now have to keep all those photos just in case somebody becomes president? Right? That's kind of the problem. You see what I'm saying here? So we don't know what's going to be important. I mean, things like garbage heaps, middens, are tremendously important to archaeologists. And that's the stuff that people 2,000 years ago, not only did they think it wasn't valuable, but they thought it was trash. We think it's really valuable. So we don't know this stuff, okay? So hopefully that answered the question. We can't tell what people in the future are going to need. We can certainly say, all right, these 3 pictures are almost identical, get rid of 2 of them. That we can probably do, but beyond that, all we can do is have people assign value, and to the extent that it takes time to do that, it's something that's going to be very difficult. James Hughes, one of our grad students, has done some work on this. It was published in Mascots 2018, I believe. I can post a link to that. I'll put a link to that on the Slack channel after I'm done.
Thank you. The next question I see comes from Sarah Bagchi. He says, in line with hybrid idea, can you speak to the challenges of the following approach? Keep the frequently accessed valuable data in high cost storage and the others in low cost ones hard disk, revisit the data characteristic periodically and move them around, which means that maybe the archive is not so static. It's a bit more dynamic in nature.
So really what you're really doing there, first of all, you keep the data, you keep all of it in the archive, okay? There's no value to taking something that's going to be used frequently and pulling and deleting it from the archive when it becomes used frequently. You just cache it in flash. This problem, so Sarab, this problem is incredibly old enough that it was actually part of my master's thesis in the early 90s. By the way, it was an old problem then too. So this problem is, and I kid you not, almost 50 years old. Alan Smith did some work on this in the early to mid 70s, okay? The idea is file migration. I've got this archive and I want to keep some stuff in memory, or some stuff on disk and some stuff on tape. How do I decide what to move around? This works if you can predict accesses. To the extent that you can say, oh, I think, you accessed data piece A, so for example, we accessed your chest x-ray, so we'll probably access your chest MRI also, and some of the older chest x-rays for you because we're thinking about, was there a change? That's easy. You decide, hey, I think I'm gonna go see that old photo today. We had no clue you were gonna do that. How would we prefetch it? I don't know if we could. So that's why it really depends on how effectively you can do this, right? There's no good answer to this. I really wish there was, but the thing is, you can only make predictions if you have enough data points to actually be able to make them. And for a lot of this migration stuff, you don't. This is an example of caching, and it's been around for a long time. But the source of things for caching is so large, and the randomness and reuse is so small that it doesn't really help all that much. Unfortunately, I wish it did. About the best you can do is say, well, we're going to keep track of what things are related and likely to be accessed together and prefetch those. And I think that's probably that's probably the most effective thing to do is, hey, we wrote these together. They're probably related. Let's bring them back together.
Okay, thank you. The next question comes from Jeff Kenning. What's your opinion on the trade-off between data formats in space? For example, XML is bulky, but somewhat self-describing. PNM is an easily readable image format, but hugely space wasteful. How do you think we should make the trade-off?
So that's a really good question. My suspicion on how to make the trade-off is that you would use a general purpose compression algorithm. It won't save as much space as a specialized one, But for many formats, that's a good way to go. For example, if you take an image and gzip it, or use some other kind of, use another kind of compression algorithm, that's a standard, you'll save 80, 90% of the space that you would if you used GIF. You won't save as much as JPEG because JPEG does lossy compression and JPEG knows what you can afford to lose. MP4, MP3 are the same thing. They know what you can afford to lose, so that makes them more efficient. But if you want lossless compression, you pick one lossless compression algorithm and use it. Use it on everything. So if you want XML, great. So in fact, by the way, for what it's worth, I'm pretty sure, not 100%, but about 90% sure that Keynote and other programs that use XML for data storage actually do this. They write their data out in XML, but then they will often go and compress it using a standard compression algorithm to save the space and get the ability of, hey, it's easier to read the darn thing, right? But now that means one extra thing to keep track of. What compression algorithm am I using? So it's not so bad, but maybe a little bit of an issue, okay? I think that's what you're going to end up having to use.
Thank you. Let's see if we have any other questions. I do have one maybe comment / question. One of the things that intrigued me about DNA storage is for archives, making a copy with DNA seems like very, very low cost. It's a medium that naturally is self-replicating with errors, of course, which is a problem. But there's nothing like it in any other media. We always have to basically do malloc memcopy, right? There's nothing like it. And DNA, there's something unique about that property or that media that I'm hoping somebody can take advantage of.
Well, so that's absolutely right. DNA can make lots and lots of copies, and they're very small. Now, to be fair, it turns out that you can do the same thing that DNA does with optical disc, for example. Okay, you could have a system for optical disc that said, okay, I'm going to have two optical. In fact, people, not only can you have one, you could go buy one today. It's called an optical disc replicator. You put a disc in one tray, a recorded disc in one tray. You put a blank disc in another tray, and it makes a copy, which is exactly what DNA does, except at a much smaller and faster scale, probably. Okay, so that's something you could do. But because remember, DNA, when you make a copy, you really are reading it and then writing, except you're not reading it all the way to bits. You're only reading it all the way up to, I see the base pairs. There, you'd want to make lots of copies and figure out what kinds of issues come in. By the way, as an interesting, and you're absolutely right, by the way, DNA has that advantage. One interesting thing about DNA that I learned is that one of the troubles with codecs for DNA is that with most kinds of archival media, the only thing you're worried about are bit flips. Okay, you're worried about a 0 looking like a 1 or a 1 looking like a 0. For DNA, you have to be worried about insertions and deletions as well. That's weird. It means the coding gets even harder for DNA. I didn't realize that until until the DNA guy's like, yeah, good point. It does do insertions, doesn't it? Makes coding harder, turns out.
Thank you. I think we're almost out of time. Maybe if you have a moment to look at a thread that Keith Smith started with, again, commenting on indexing, and then a couple other people added some notes.
Let me take a quick look at that.
Just to make sure we've answered it.
Yeah, let's see. So is this the challenge? Okay, yeah. So I think I would agree. Okay, so reading that thread over, I would agree with Jeff. I agree completely. Jeff is right. Your re-indexing will be necessary. Okay, and AI would be helpful to do re-indexing, and that's why you want to have individual devices have their own index, because re-indexing an entire, re-indexing something is going to be difficult. If you can do it a small device at a time, hey, so I'll give you a good example where this might be necessary, right? Suppose I tell my devices storing human genomes to be on the lookout for genetic diseases, okay? I give it a list of all the genetic diseases, all of the changes that might cause problems, say, be aware for these, right? Time goes on, we discover 20 new ones. Well, gee, I guess I'm just gonna have to tell everybody to look for 20 more things. And that's exactly what you would do, is ship out the changes to each one of the devices and say, next time you do indexing, look for these too, because you might find something here, right? So that's, I think, what you're going to want to do, right? Keith is right that he might index them based on who's in them and where, right? A future researcher, right, might want them indexed based on clothing. Well, as long as you can give me a program that indexes clothing, I can give it to every one of the devices. That was the idea of, we'll do background processing, we'll look for stuff, right? And Tony's right that indexing is a very hard problem. Is because what people want and how people look for it varies by person. And I don't care about clothing, but I can certainly see my wife caring about clothing. I don't care about what people were eating, but I can certainly see my brother, the food chemist, who might care about what people are eating. So that's the kind of thing where I can't look for what I don't know to look for. And by doing indexing on individual devices, we also have the advantage that I can say, I'm just going to look at these few things. I'm going to take a couple of drives worth and do this kind of indexing. Another couple of drives will do another kind of indexing. So one of them will do Tony's search, and one of them will do Keith's search, and one of them will do Gala's search. And okay, well, that's great. So I don't have to involve the whole archive saying index everything for this. Much easier to have a distributed index in that form.
Okay, we'll take one last question live, and after that,
Okay.
if it's okay to stay on Slack or just being able to answer.
Sure.
So this
Absolutely.
question, I'm sorry, it was earlier question, I missed it. It's from Devesh Tiwari.
Yep.
Can you please share more insights about the known failure modes, reliability characteristics, and blast radius of the glass media? How would you compare that with the tape media?
Okay, so good question. Blast radius of glass, clearly there are a couple of failure modes. One of them is failure in writing data, which you can discover if you read it back. If the pulse was too long, it may throw out a couple of bits nearby. I'm pretty sure they're doing things that actually cover that problem. Obviously, one failure mode of glass is, oops, drop the mic. Probably not the best idea to do with glass, but that is a failure mode, and it will cause damage. Okay. The blast radius then is about 1 terabyte. And the blast radius really depends not just on the media itself, but how you protect the media. So for example, if I have a RAID group that has a width of 1,000, and by the way, this is not unreasonable. Remember, Hotmail had width of 254, I believe, for RAID, 251 plus 3. If I lost 4 drives, I lost data from 250 of them. Oops, that sucks. So how you do erasure coding has a lot to do with blast radius as well, okay? Now, as far as reliability characteristics, glass actually lasts a really long time. Several years ago, Hitachi had developed a long-lived glass disk that they could store data on. And I remember being interviewed by one of the science publications, popular science publications, asking me what I thought about this, because they made the claim, probably correct, that the glass would survive for 20 million years. My comment was that I have a term for 20 million year old glass. It's called sand. Right? Great that it survives for 20 million years, but where are you going to put it for 20 million years? Hell, we don't know where to put it for 1,000 years, right? Remember, time is really long. If I say I want to keep something for 100,000 years, that's from apes walking on the plains of Africa to now. That's hard, right? I don't think you can do that. So that's where the blast radius is. What you can do is try to tailor the erasure codes to the characteristics of the device. Blast radius for glass, in that, the sort of minimal blast radius is pretty big. You lost the glass, it got damaged. But you can use ECC to get around that. For DNA, it might be a much smaller blast radius, but much more likely to happen. Failure mode for glass, from what I understand, and again, I can give you pointers to the papers on this, it's much less likely to happen than it is for a lot of other media because glass is a really stable thing. No, glass doesn't flow. That's an urban myth.
Okay, thank you very much. And we took more of your time than we budgeted. And thank you for managing this new format.
Thank you.
So for everyone, let's thank Ethan. Thank you.
I will get you guys. I will make the slides available. Should I just send them to you, Erez, or?
Yeah, we'll post them somehow. We'll figure out how to do that.
Okay.
Slack remains open. So anybody who wants to ask questions of Ethan or any other of the speakers, it will remain open. And otherwise, thank you for the first day, and we'll see you here tomorrow at 7 a.m. Pacific.
Great.
Thank you.
Hey, thanks a lot, Erez.